I often get asked what color binding you should choose when you're making a quilt. And I always go with whatever the quilt tells me, but there are a few things to consider before you make that decision. So let me help you out here. If you have a wide border on your quilt, you can always pull that same fabric and use that for binding. If you want the quilt to feel like there is a full frame around it, it's great for traditional quilts, or you just want that focus to stay on that main design in the fabric. So you can see that here done with even a more tone-on-tone print. That green fabric just extends to the edge, so you're not interrupting that feel with a different color or a different print. You can also pull a color from your main print in that border and bring that to the outside. So in this instance, I pulled the darkest value from that border print and put that little frame around it just to define that edge and create that subtle skinny frame. Here's another example where I pulled that dark gray that is in the background of the main print just to create that edge so it feels like the whole quilt is framed. If you want a strong frame, consider using a dark fabric, dark to medium dark fabric, and that will really create a very defined edge and makes all of the colors pop, especially if you have a light background. So this works really well for both modern designs and traditional quilts. You can see how it really defines that edge, creates a little frame, and it's great to use for even just scrappy quilts with no borders. You can also take a more medium tone and bring that out. So what I chose here, I chose a medium gray binding. So I went with the medium values found in the quilt and used that for that frame so it wouldn't be too harsh. This way it's subtle but still very defined. Here's another example where I chose some of the medium tones in the quilt and brought that to the outside versus choosing the hard dark ones. It kind of makes the binding a little more subtle, makes it blend in with the quilt more. If you have a borderless quilt, but maybe the background extends the design out to the edges, consider just using that same background fabric for your border or for your binding. I really love that sometimes because it creates that full, kind of like an infinity pool. So it just doesn't have that defined frame. It's just creating that same value, the same feel of the background all the way to the edge of the quilt. You can also choose a pop of color for some fun contrast. You can find something that is within the quilt. For example, here is a focus color that I brought to the outside, and this creates a very harmonious quilt, in this case a table runner. So bringing that gold to the outside really frames it, and it also helps pull the eye to that gold color within the quilt. You can choose something like red, something that's a little bit dominant, but in this case it's also mixed within the quilt, so it's not going to be too harsh, but it's definitely going to get that attention for that frame around the edge. This is a great thing to do if you have very scrappy quilts, but maybe there is a print in there that you can really use to define it. But even if you didn't have a focus print, it is a great way to frame a very scrappy quilt with a dark binding. I love using a striped fabric for my binding, and you can either do that by just cutting it straight. It creates that really fun, playful border or an edge around the whole quilt. Sometimes it is even lighter, but it just gives the quilt some fun and playfulness. And you could do it like this, cut on the straighter grain, or you can cut it on the bias to create that diagonal feel of a binding, and that even gives it more movement and brings your eye straight to the binding. You can create a similar feel with a plaid. So a lot of plaids are either created or printed on the bias, and that really creates a fun, playful edge on a quilt, especially if it's a playful quilt. Like both of these are holiday quilts, so they really create that fun, playful edge. And again, you can cut that on the bias, but some of them are already printed on the bias, so you don't have to worry about it. For even more playfulness, try doing a scrappy binding. A scrappy binding you can create from just the scraps from making the quilt, and that will just keep that fun scrappiness going all the way out to the edge. It keeps your eye moving, so you're not really pulled into that edge of the quilt. I love doing that, especially if I have really great leftovers and I can just use that for the quilt. No worries, it's definitely gonna match. You know that, so it really creates a fun quilt. At the end of the day, it's all about testing. So take that fabric you're considering, lay it right next to the quilt, step away, and see what works for you. Again, you do you. You can play with it.